All right, so if you're here with us for this deep dive, you must want the real lowdown on ESG now that Trump is back in the White House. Well, we've got a lot of information for you today. We're talking about changes to global trade and investment, and even, maybe what kind of car you'll be driving in a few years.
It is interesting what we're seeing here. On the one hand, you have this global push towards ESG, which of course means environmental, social, and governance factors. Investors are looking at ESG more and more these days when they're deciding what companies to invest in. But then you've got Trump, who's always been pretty skeptical of ESG. He thinks that a lot of ESG initiatives are holding back economic growth.
Right, it's like these two totally different views of the world are clashing. It really makes you wonder, can Trump's America First policies really work in a world where everyone is starting to care more about climate change and ethical supply chains and stuff like that?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? To really understand what might happen here, I think we need to look deeper. We need to look past just the words that people are using and look at the actual data. For example, a lot of people think that ESG is bad for profits. But actually, studies from groups like McKinsey have shown that companies with good ESG performance tend to make more money for their investors. And we're not talking about just a small difference here.
Really? So it's not just about feeling good. ESG is actually good for business.
Exactly. And that makes it even more interesting to think about what Trump might do. For example, he has said that he wants to get rid of parts of the Inflation Reduction Act, especially the money that it gives to green energy companies. Now, it's probably not going to get rid of the whole law. It's helping the economy, and even a lot of Republicans like renewable energy these days. But I do think we're going to see some big changes, especially in places where those green energy companies employ a lot of people.
I see. You mentioned earlier how ESG is a global issue. Didn't you have an example of how this is already playing out on the world stage?
Yeah, absolutely. Take South Korea, for example. They've been putting a lot of money into green technologies, and they have something called domestic carbon allowances, which they've been giving to companies like Hyundai Steel and Dongkook Steel. Well, those allowances have actually caused problems for them in the U.S. The U.S. sees these allowances as unfair subsidies. They think it's giving Korean companies an unfair advantage.
Wow. So even before Trump changes any policies, we're already seeing countries using ESG as a way to get ahead in global trade. That's pretty wild. It makes me think about another piece of this whole puzzle, Trump's stance on climate change. He's never really been a big supporter of taking action on climate change. So how does that fit into this whole ESG conversation?
Well, this is where things get interesting. So even though Trump might not think climate change is a big deal, he is willing to use anything he can to give America an advantage in trade deals. And guess what? Carbon regulations could be a very powerful new tool for him. The U.S. Trade Representative is actually thinking about putting carbon fees on products that are imported from countries that don't have strong environmental rules.
Wait, so you're saying Trump might actually use environmental regulations to help American businesses? That's a bit of a surprise.
It is. And it just shows how complicated this all is. ESG is no longer just about companies being responsible. It's becoming part of these global power struggles and trade wars.
Yeah.
And for countries like South Korea that rely heavily on exports, this could be a big problem.
So we've got the Inflation Reduction Act maybe changing, carbon regulations being used as weapons in trade deals. It sounds like a lot of companies are going to be in a tough spot. But are there any companies that might actually benefit from all this?
There are, and this is where this idea of transition finance becomes really important. Transition finance is all about finding ways to move from the old way of doing things to a more sustainable future. And there are some areas that could do really well under Trump administration.
Okay, so what exactly is transition finance? Can you give me some real-world examples of what that looks like?
Well, one good example is nuclear energy, specifically these small modular reactors, or SMRs as they're called. They're like tiny nuclear power plants, much smaller than the traditional ones, which makes them cheaper and quicker to build. Plus, they really fit into Trump's whole Made in America idea.
Ah, I see. So instead of these huge construction projects that can take forever, we're talking about building these small reactors in factories and then just putting them together like Lego blocks on site. That would create a lot of new manufacturing jobs in America.
Exactly. And they're actually much safer than traditional nuclear plants because of their design. Another area that could see a lot of growth is something called carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or CCUS for short. This is basically about capturing the carbon emissions from things like power plants and factories, and then either using that carbon for something else or storing it underground.
So instead of letting all that CO2 go into the atmosphere, we could trap it and use it to make something useful, What could you actually do with that captured carbon?
Well, you can use it for things like helping to get more oil out of the ground. You could also use it to make building materials. And some companies are even looking into using it to create synthetic fuels. It's a way to make industries that Trump likes, like oil and gas, a little bit cleaner without having to shut them down completely.
Wow, that's pretty amazing, turning pollution into profit. But I'm guessing it's not that simple. There must be some challenges, right?
Oh, of course. The technology is still being developed and it's expensive to implement on a large scale. But if the government helps out and companies keep investing in research and development, CCUS has huge potential. And then there are the power grids. They're what keeps our lights on, and they need a big upgrade to handle all the new renewable energy that's coming online.
Right. You talked about smart grids before. Could you explain for our listeners who might not be familiar with them, what exactly makes them smart?
Sure. So think of the power grid like a one-way street. Electricity just flows in one direction. A smart grid is more like a network where electricity can flow in multiple directions. Smart grids use sensors and data and automation to be more efficient and reliable. Imagine if the grid could automatically reroute power when there's an outage or adjust to changes in demand.
So it's like the grid can think for itself and make decisions in real time.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And it's not just about efficiency and reliability either. Smart grids are also really important for integrating renewable energy sources like solar and wind power, because they can help smooth out the ups and downs in energy production from those sources.
This is all very high-level stuff. What can the average person do to prepare for these changes? Should we all be running out to buy solar panels and electric cars?
Well, I wouldn't rush to do anything drastic just yet. The most important thing is to stay informed. Keep up with the news, understand what's happening, and maybe talk to a financial advisor who knows about ESG and how it might affect your investments.
So knowledge is power.
Exactly. And it's also a good idea to look at your own investments and think about whether they are aligned with the companies and industries that are going to do well in this new world.
So make sure you're not betting against the trend.
That's right. And remember that ESG isn't just about making money. It's also about supporting the things that you care about. If you care about climate change or social justice or ethical business practices, make sure your investments reflect those values.
So we can use our money to make a difference, like voting with our wallets.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of the choices you make every day as a consumer. Buy products from companies that are doing things the right way. Choose sustainable products. Every little bit helps.
So walk the walk and not just talk the talk. Are there any other things people can do to have their voices heard?
Definitely. Talk to your friends and family about ESG. Talk to your colleagues. Let your elected officials know what's important to you. The more people who are aware of these issues, the more likely we are to see real change.
So it's about more than just being a smart investor or a conscious consumer. It's about becoming an advocate for a better world.
Exactly. Remember, ESG is a movement. It's a change in how we think about business and investing, and even how we think about our own choices.
We've covered a lot of ground here today. We've talked about what Trump's policies might mean for ESG, the risks and the opportunities, and even some things that people can do to navigate this changing landscape. But the big question is, what's next for ESG? Is this just a passing fad, or is it a fundamental shift in how we do business?
That's the big question. No one knows for sure, but if you look at the trends, I think it's safe to say that ESG is here to stay.
Really? Even with someone like Trump in the White House, who hasn't been very supportive of ESG in the past?
Yes, I think so. ESG is being driven by a lot of different forces, not just government regulations. Investors want to know that the companies they're investing in are doing the right thing. Consumers are making choices based on sustainability and ethics more and more, and companies are realizing that being good at ESG can actually make them more money and make their businesses more resilient.
So even if things change politically, the underlying reasons why ESG is important are still there.
Exactly. And don't forget the global context. The U.S. isn't the only country that matters. Europe, for example, is way ahead of the U.S. in terms of ESG regulations and investments.
So even if the U.S. slows down under Trump, the rest of the world is still moving forward. That would put pressure on American companies to keep up.
Right. And here's something else to think about. I actually think that even Trump understands how important ESG is becoming. He might not like the term or agree with all the policies, but he's a businessman. And he knows that consumers and investors are starting to care about these things.
So maybe he'll try to rebrand ESG as something that fits better with his America First agenda.
It's possible. It will be interesting to see how he and his administration try to shape the ESG narrative.
Right. It feels like a new chapter is beginning. What are some of the things you'll be watching closely in the next few years?
I think that carbon tariff thing is going to be a big one. If the U.S. really does start charging those fees on imports from other countries, it could start a whole trade war. Other countries might retaliate, and it could really change how global trade works. It could even have a big impact on how countries work together to deal with climate change.
It sounds like one of those situations where every decision has a bunch of consequences.
Yeah, exactly. Another thing to watch is the role of technology in all of this. We've talked about smart grids and CCUS, but there's a lot of other cool stuff happening too, like using artificial intelligence to reduce waste, and blockchain to make supply chains more transparent. Even space technology could be used to track environmental changes and come up with new solutions.
So technology can play a big part in making the world more sustainable.
Absolutely. But technology alone isn't enough. We also need to think about how social justice fits into all of this. More and more, people are realizing that environmental issues and social justice issues are connected. If we want to create a truly sustainable world, we need to address things like income inequality and racial injustice and human rights abuses.
Right. So ESG is about more than just protecting the environment. It's about creating a fairer world for everyone.
Exactly. And that's where I think the real power of ESG lies.
It's definitely exciting to think about all the good that could come from it. But let's be real. There are going to be some challenges along the way. We've talked about trade wars and market instability and the possibility that people might try to use ESG for their own political game. How can we avoid those negative outcomes?
Well, I think transparency is really important. Companies need to be honest about what they're doing, and investors and consumers need to be able to trust the information they're getting. We also need to hold companies accountable for their actions. And we need to be careful about greenwashing. That's where companies try to make themselves look more environmentally friendly than they actually are. And maybe most importantly, we need governments and businesses and regular people to all work together.
So it's going to take a lot of effort from everyone to make this work.
It will. And we need to change how we define success. It's not just about making as much money as possible anymore. It's about creating value for everyone, for employees and customers and communities and the planet.
That's a big change in how we think about things. Do you think that having Trump in the White House, even though he's been skeptical of ESG in the past, could actually be a good thing for ESG in the long run?
Well, it is kind of a strange situation. But sometimes it takes a big shakeup to make real change happen. Maybe Trump's skepticism will actually force the ESG movement to get stronger. Companies might have to work harder to show that ESG is good for business and to show that it can really make a difference.
So this period of uncertainty, instead of being a step backward, could actually speed up the progress of ESG and lead to better solutions.
It's definitely possible. And it shows the ESG isn't just some fixed set of rules, it's constantly changing and evolving.
As we come to the end of our deep dive today, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought. We've talked about a lot of complicated stuff, the risks and opportunities of ESG in a world with Trump as president. But the future of ESG isn't set in stone. It depends on the choices that we all make.
Exactly. So as you think about all of this, ask yourself, what role do I want to play? Do I just want to sit back and watch what happens? Or do I want to be a part of creating a better future? The choice is yours, but the future depends on all of us.
That's a great way to put it. I hope that this deep dive has given you a better understanding of ESG and what it means for the future, and that you feel inspired to get involved in your own way.
ESG is a movement that's changing the world. Stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged.